Ah, the sun is out in the sky above. Beautiful. But if you were a medieval, how do you think you'd cope with struggling water infrastructure, crop and food vulnerability, and poor healthcare preparedness? Well, sorry, that's actually a list of problems that we still experience in modern day England when there is the tiniest amount of sun. But if it's bad now, it must have been a damn sight worse then. It should first be noted that for the medievals, summer was a busy time of the year, especially for the peasants. There wasn't any laying out on sun loungers and hanging around the Lord's duck pond sipping a cold glass of Ye Olde Brew. Today we will travel back to the Middle Ages and take a look at how the medievals coped in the heat of summer. So you think you know everything about knights, castles and kings? Well, hold on to your chainmail because we're starting a history channel all about the Roman Empire. Now I know what you're thinking, wait, Roman Empire, isn't that before my favourite medieval legends? Well, yes, but stick with me. Rome is where it all started. From the fall of the mighty empire to the rise of your medieval knights, it's a story that's all connected. So if you're ready to learn about this incredible time period, join the toga party over at our new channel, The Roman Empire. It's going to be totally worth the detour in your historical journey, so I'll leave a link to it in the description below. And now for today's video, welcome to Medieval Madness. The heat is on. In his encyclopedia Etymologies, written early in the Middle Ages, around 625, the theologian Bishop Isidore of Seville explained that summer, aestas in Latin, derived its name from heat, scorched and dried up. Just over 500 years later, in his mid-13th century encyclopedia on the properties of things, philosopher Bartholomew Anglicus described summer as a hot and dry season that lasts 3 months beginning at the sign of Cancer on the 17th of June and ending at the end of the sign of Virgo on the 18th of September. June was a busy and challenging time in the medieval calendar. It was the start of harvest season, and with long periods of heat and a lack of rain, there were often droughts and fires to contend with. There was also heat exhaustion and sunstroke from working out in the fields. The sun was at its highest point during the summer, Bartholomew Anglicus explained, and that meant that it shone directly onto the labourers' heads, causing an excess of yellow bile. Humoral theory was the system of medicine that detailed the workings of the human body. Used by Greek and Roman physicians and philosophers, it was popular with the medievals. The humours referred to the 4 bodily fluids, blood, yellow bile, black bile and phlegm, that were believed to affect a person's temperament and health. Any imbalance in the humours was thought to change a person's personality and cause illness. Yellow bile was a hot and dry humour thought to cause outbursts of anger. According to Bartholomew, as the body heated up in the summer, it perspired and then dried, weakening it and causing fevers along with other hot and dry diseases. Medical manuscripts contained various recipes for remedies to help soothe and lessen the effects of sunburn. Bold's Leech Book is a text written in the middle of the 10th century, and it contains a compilation of both internal and external maladies. One recipe advises the sufferer to, quote, boil in butter tender ivy twigs and smear therewith, as a sort of relieving sun cream, or something more similar to the after sun that you can just buy today. The Trotula, 3 texts on women's health that were composed in the 12th century in the Italian port town of Salerno, recorded a recipe using deer fat for, quote, roughness of the face caused by the sun. Another balm for, quote, sunburn and fissures of any kind that raises the skin and colours it beautifully, included ingredients such as lily root, frankincense and mastic, as well as white lead, which, of course, is now known to be completely toxic. Women from the elite classes tried to keep their skin as pale and white as possible. Tan skin was associated with the peasants who worked out in the fields all day, so only a high-status woman could keep her skin fair. So wealthy women might not get sunburnt, but it was likely that they would get metal poisoning, which could lead to coma and death. So pick your poison. I guess all things considered, it probably beats working out in the field all day. For head pains from the heat of the sun, the Trotula recommended using rose oil as it, quote, takes away burning and heat, and if the head is anointed with it, quote, it is good for those pains which happen sometimes in the whole head or part of it. If a lady of leisure really had no choice but to go out in the summer sun, then it was recommended that she wear a wide-brimmed hat and carried a parasol. Peasants really didn't have the luxury of such a sunshade. However, there are illuminated manuscripts that show them hard at work in the fields wearing hats and lighter pieces of clothing, rather than the woolens worn in the winter months. Some of the men are even topless, like those depicted in the August page of Heatwaves de Duc de Berry, a 15th century book of hours created for the Duke. Don't drink and drown. The harvest season opened with haymaking in June and July. The main use for hay was as fodder for livestock and horses over the winter months. The animals needed to be kept away from the fields during the summer months so that they wouldn't eat the precious crops, especially the wheat. Sometimes a peasant family had to cut back on their food intake during the summer to fatten up their pig so that they could slaughter it and live off the produce during the winter months. Hay was needed in large quantities to sustain the valuable animals during the harsh months ahead, so a bumper crop was always welcome. But that too brought its own challenges. A large crop was bulky and could easily rot if not prepared well, so care had to be taken to dry it properly in the heat of the sun before storage. Everyone joined in the harvest, male and female, young and old. The hay had to be either scythed or raked into piles, and it was back-breaking work in the heat of the summer sun. The elderly were more likely to die out in the harvest fields during high summer from exhaustion and heat stroke. Plus, there's no telling how many peasants drowned in a lake, stream, or river whilst trying to cool themselves off after a sweaty day of work in the July or August heat, as swimming seems to have been a rare skill among the medievals. It wasn't until 1587 that Cambridge professor Everard Digby wrote a Latin treatise on learning how to swim. It was 16 years earlier that the university's vice-chancellor banned all students from swimming in the river at Grantchester. But not even the threat of a public beating could stop the students getting into the water. Just as many drowned before as after the ban, sometimes as many as 3 at a time. And who knows how many accidents and deaths were caused by drinking far too much ale whilst trying to quench their thirst on a drowsily warm day. Harvest time usually began in June, and droves of workers would descend on the larger estates to take advantage of temporary employment. Work began at dawn before the sun became too hot. The peasants reaped the hay first before turning to the wheat fields in July. The workers were often paid in sheaves of wheat rather than money. Some worked for their lord for nothing, as they had an obligation to perform corvée work for their lord. This was a form of unpaid labour lasting for a limited period of time as a tax for living on the land. Sometimes the peasants had to provide their own scythes or sickles to be given employment or reap the harvest with their bare hands. Once the sheaves were made, they were tied with either a strand of rye or a rope. Workers would often receive wine or ale before, during, and at the end of the day. As you all well know, it's always a good idea to mix alcohol and hard work under the blazing summer sun. Once the reaping was done, the sheaves were moved and stored, and the threshing began. Any other cereals were threshed to loosen the grains from the straw. In some places, such as Normandy, the peasants returned to the fields for any straw that had not been cut, as it was used for thatching roofs, stuffing mattresses, and bedding for livestock. Once the fields were empty, the peasants had the right of gleaning and could return to pick up any grain that had fallen to the ground. Death in the sun. Accidents will happen at any time of the year, especially where children are concerned. But the leaving open of doors and windows because of the heat of a summer's evening posed its own special risks. Particularly if you were going to go off and leave your child unattended. Babies did seem to spend quite a bit of time alone in their cradles during the Middle Ages as their parents were busy elsewhere. That's exactly what the parents of 1-month-old Joanna de Arlond did in Queeneth Ward in London. On returning, her parents had found that a pig had wandered in through the open shop door and bitten the child's head so badly that, quote, despite her mother's best efforts, the baby died at midnight. Not all summers were hot though. In England, during the unusually cold weather of 1351 in the August, a pig herd was reported to have died of the cold, and a young girl of 7 died of exposure when she got lost outside in a June storm. It was also in June, but in 1388, when a drunken man fell into a furrow and died of the cold after coming home from a tavern on a Friday night. It was common for most builders and labourers to be paid more in the summer than in the winter because of the longer daylight hours. In 1306, the stonemasons who worked on Exeter Cathedral were paid 5¼ pence per day in the summer, but only 4½ pence in the winter. Building work kept the men busy during the summer months, and there were plenty of specialities to be undertaken such as wattle and daub work, thatching, masonry, and carpentry. More construction work in summer meant that there were more accidents. 11% of fatal accidents happened to medieval men whilst they were involved in building work. Danger was everywhere, from sawing off a finger to stepping off a scaffold. One labourer broke his arm when it became trapped in a wheel and cable that was being used to raise 2 stones. Fields of Fire. Medieval summertime was the perfect time for droughts, fires, and plagues. There were exceptions, but in Europe, the second wave of plague pandemic that had begun with the Black Death almost always hit during the summer. Mortality from the disease peaked between June and September from the middle of the 14th right up to the 17th century. It was a trend that did not go unnoticed. Medieval scientists and physicians believed that the summer air was corrupted and infected, and that the bad air, or miasma, was responsible for the outbreaks. The belief wasn't abandoned until the 1880s when it was replaced by the germ theory. Just as it does today, summer heat and dryness became a fire hazard in both urban and rural areas. In 1048, the monk John of Worcester reported in his chronicle that, quote, "Fire in the air, commonly called wildfire, burnt many townships and cornfields in Derbyshire and several other regions." Towns and cities with their timber-framed houses were already vulnerable to dangers of fire, and a dry, hot summer only exacerbated the risks. In Paris, a royal ordinance required all citizens to keep a pot of water next to their door in case of fire during the summer. For the medieval peasant, summer was a busy time. As around 90% of the population were involved in some form of agriculture, it was a time to get things done, and everyone had to get involved. Just as we do today, they looked for ways to protect themselves from the heat, used a form of sunscreen, went swimming, sought out shade, and worried about wildfires and droughts. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please let me know in the comments down below if you enjoyed it and what sort of content you'd like to see us make in the future, but we do release a video every Friday, so make sure you subscribe to catch up with those. Until next time, hope everyone has an absolutely awesome week. Cheers everyone!